The magical thing with the Pacific pay gap is it's not until you kind of launch into it that you start to see patterns in your own places of work. There's this really unique experience for Pacific people where when we're included into spaces like universities, like the Big Four, we're expected to be grateful for our inclusion. So when we question the terms of agreement for our inclusion, people get upset. And they get upset because they're like, well, we let you in, isn't that enough? It's like, no, actually enough would be paying me the same as this guy. Enough would be recognising that I offer something to this institution that others don't. Pacific women get paid 85 cents on the dollar compared to Pākehā men in the academy. So even in spaces that are meant to be really, really liberal and really advanced, we experience a pay gap. I earn less than my Pākehā female colleagues. It was a Pākehā female colleague who went, I'm sorry, you're getting paid what? No, you need to be paid this much. I'm getting paid this much. This is not okay. And it's that sort of allyship that will move this conversation forward. And so sometimes I think that we have a hesitation to talk about our experiences. We're told not to talk about pay, right? So it's rude. But when we don't talk about money, we don't find solutions, or we don't even know there's a problem. So I think that would be sort of my experience with it, is that once I started talking about it, people started sharing information, and then I realised that not only did I research pay gaps, I also experienced them. And so in this weird twist of fate, I guess, was trying to work out how to rectify the thing that I was researching. I study racism, it's what I do. Most individuals are not racist. The structures that they are working within sort of enable racism to happen. So if you approach an individual and you talk to them as a human being, a lot becomes possible. Build relationships with your bosses, build relationships with your CEOs, so that they start to understand the impact of 50 cents on the dollar for you is huge for your family and the community. It's not that much of a difference for them. And so I think it's about that, helping them to understand that it's not just about an extra 50 cents on the dollar. It's actually about being able to pay the rent or the mortgage, being able to buy food, being able to do something with your kids for the school holidays, being able to pay for a funeral without having to go into debt. When people say, Pacific don't talk about money, birthdays, weddings, funerals, any family emergency, we talk about money. Let's have that conversation in the workplace. Let's talk about what we're worth, who's giving us what, and how do we move to a point where we're collectively benefiting from the same work that's being put in. When we don't talk about it, the only person who benefits is the employer. One of the things we know from this pandemic is that the employers have made a lot of money, right? So people who were already rich before the pandemic started have just got richer. The rest of us who are not rich are paying more. Inflation in New Zealand, the cost of housing, the cost of living, the cost of groceries, everything is going up. So those at the top are still earning more money than they were in 2019, 2020, and Pacific people are not experiencing the same benefits as everyone else for their economic growth. I think New Zealand is ready now to have this conversation, but it's still going to be uncomfortable. And we just have to sit in the discomfort of recognizing that we have continually devalued Pacific labour since colonisation in the Pacific. They intentionally came into our islands, educated us to a point where we would only be good for labour, imported us as cheap labour, and then continued that devaluing of Pacific knowledges and Pacific labour till today. If you don't have that historical context, it's a little bit hard to understand how we got to this point. But it's not racism from today, it's racism from that first point of contact, and it's come all the way through, and now we have to work out what we're going to do from now. That's why it's a hard conversation to have, because we're not just talking about the individual in front of us, we're talking about an entire history of devaluing us. And so the individual in front of us is fronting a historical injustice. And so this work is crucial because Pacific people deserve this. Right? We're not asking for anything more than anyone else. We're asking for the same. And at what point can you say you don't deserve the same as everyone else just based on your ethnicity? And I think that's what New Zealand has to come to terms with, is until today, we have been okay with it as a society. What do we need to do now to make it so that Pacific people get the same as everyone else? Collective action is going to be what gets us there. You need to Imagine what your workplace would look like without you and without your friends. Who would do that work? If all Pacific construction workers walked off the job for one day, what would that look like? These are the questions we have to start asking and asking the industries to imagine. So collectively ask for more and engage with this inquiry, because the HRC sits at tables that we can't imagine, right? We can't do this by ourselves. We do need allies, and we need allies who are prepared to be uncomfortable. And we need allies who are powerful, who sit at the tables. We need the allies who build the tables, right? We need people who make those decisions to come with us. So I think engaging with the inquiry means that your voices will be heard at tables that we don't get to sit at. And it's really important that those people at those tables hear your stories, because if they don't hear those stories, they're just going to be like, oh, it's just 25 cents. What's the big deal? Well, the big deal is that I can't feed my kids. The big deal is that I have to go into debt to pay my rent. The big deal is that my children don't get a Christmas. The big deal is that I work over 40 hours a week and still don't have a living wage or can afford this city. And this is the reality of that 25 cents, because it's the reality of the 25 cents that will make them take action. And that's a story that you have to share. We can't share that. We need Pacific people in those industries to share those stories.